What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. We're going to start with Thanos, and there are two and maybe more competing builds of this list. This is the ongoing version, which looks to play effective, powerful spreads of points in a dangerous way for opponents because it's very often difficult to predict whether a full lane will actually stay at the power that it has. The deck is extremely powerful, but I do want to be explicit on this. You can very easily cut Captain Carter for Dazzler. You don't need to buy the season pass in order to play this deck, even though Captain Carter is pretty damn good. This is a deck that is attempting every single game to fill all the spots on the board. And because of that, it ends up being a deck that does require a little bit more planning out than would otherwise be expected. One of the things that I think people can really fall into traps with this deck with is they play all of their stones, they have their Mind Stone Nut Draw or whatever, and then they realize that they actually needed the board space for things later in the game. Don't automatically vomit all of the stones. It is generally going to be the correct direction, but there are going to be situations against certain decks, Clog obviously, but Scream decks as well, where playing all of the stones can be an actively harmful thing. This is the sort of default version of Thanos in my mind. Even though the Strange Supreme build has surpassed it in play rate, I don't think it's surpassed it in pure points and general threat. This is a deck that is very consistently going 20 plus in a bunch of different lanes. It is able to flexibly distribute its power in dangerous ways, and it is genuinely difficult to play against. In addition, it has less obvious counterplay than the Strange Supreme deck does, although it has more counterplay because it is an ongoing deck. This is a very powerful deck that has some notably powerful counters, among them Killmonger and Enchantress. You'll run into those a lot, but I do think it's the appropriate place to start the discussion of the metagame because it is very clear to me that Thanos is back in the driver's seat. This is my version of Tech Thanos, and I've had a lot of success with it, just trying to be a sort of reactive Strange Supreme as my big lane winner and then tech cards to handle the rest kind of deck. The thing that is good about this deck is that it is much more well-rounded than the ongoing build. And by well-rounded, I mean it's less vulnerable to things like Killmonger. It's less vulnerable to things like Enchantress. It has reasonable counterplay even to things like Shang-Chi and Shadow King, thanks to being a Cosmo deck. In other words, this is a deck that I consider one of the more balanced and powerful in the game, where the ongoing deck sort of seeks to move to extremes, and by moving to extremes, ends up a little bit more easily counterable, but also as a baseline higher level of power. When you ask me which one I prefer playing, I like this one. I feel like I'm in more games when I play this list than with the ongoing list. There are less hammers that instantly lose me the game, but this is a list that is, while powerful, a little bit less on the points than the ongoing build. One of the things that you'll run into is that you don't really have a lot of giant dudes. Thanos is 12 and he can get a little bit bigger, but this really goes to show the influence of Thanos's buff from 10 to 12. Because him being 12 makes him an actual large unit a decent amount of the time, and the largest in this deck, him at 10 is not meaningfully all that much bigger than a Mockingbird. It really has mattered for this deck, and that is why I like using the tech cards as my sort of pseudo big cards here. These are cards that are there to win lanes when we just don't have the points to do so. This is almost like if Sarah Control was a Thanos deck. Keeping in mind that Thanos is a very popular thing right now, I think this deck is a great place to start in trying to beat it. It's a little bit less of a hard move towards this, and you will feel a little bit of pain compared to the normal version of Scream, but Ika's build of Dark Hawk with Scream has been very successful for me recently. It was a very, very solid climbing list, in large part because of the prominence of Thanos. Now, I don't think you should get ahead of yourselves. This is not a guaranteed win versus Thanos. Their good draws are better against you because they're getting these cards out of the deck before the Darkhawk actually gets there. But generally speaking, due to limitations on board space and hand space, the Darkhawk is still going to be a pretty dang big guy. Even your Cast Nova, you might look at this and think, oh, I'm just always going to win those matchups. It's more like they have 2 to 4 to 6 extra points of power, but that's really all you need to swing the matchup in your favor when that's what's going on, and your backup plan, quote unquote, is as powerful as Scream, Sam, and Kraven are. When playing this, I did feel like I missed the extra 2 that would normally be Iron Patriot, but there's not really much you can do about it. I also missed, as weird as this sounds, Surt-ron, because I really like having that extra way to proc Scream, but we have the important ones, and that is what matters. One of the things that really sticks out about playing Scream after the nerf is that you are almost every single time putting her in the lane that Sam Wilson's shield is in, because of Red Guardian. It makes it have to be a 50-50. Red Guardian, one of the most played cards in the current metagame. That is something you should almost always be doing. Scream needs to be protected from Red Guardian in order to be even close to worth playing, because she's a 2-1, so that shield is very important for that. I am not overwhelmingly convinced that the normal build of Scream is actually all that bad. I don't necessarily think that... Basically, the Darkhawk build kind of reminds me of the Uncle Bannonball build, where it's like, this is right for this metagame of a week or so, but over time, as a meta sort of develops and balances out, I think normal Scream might end up just being a thing that matters a lot more, or is more important to the metagame, or is just a better choice. Right now, I would play Darkhawk. Just don't forget about this if it does come up. Clog has some natural ability to succeed in a metagame dominated by Thanos, but it is a deck that runs the risk of getting a little bit worse if people start trying to beat Thanos with Killmonger. As we discussed in the Thanos section, the card Killmonger is especially good against the ongoing builds of Thanos, but even the more balanced builds have some trouble with it. Right now, that's not a very big concern for the Clog deck, but it could be in the future. This is a deck that I think gets better the lower down the ladder you are. Players at the top end of ladder know the deal, and they're not so quick to stay or cope in the world where Clog is beating the crap out of them. Bluntly, the worse your rank is, the higher this deck's numbers are whenever I look at the stats. And a lot of that is down to, A, the play patterns against this deck require you to make a lot of reads, guess where they're going, block it off before they can, and that's the kind of thing that does not actually feel good to do. And it's the kind of thing that higher level players will do sort of, not necessarily instinctively, but after learning about it, whereas lower level players, it might not even occur to them to do. This is a very powerful list that manages to deal with the fact that so many cards in the game, and so many good cards in the game, care a lot about board space. Thanos obviously loves filling up the board. However, Strange Supreme and Sam Wilson are very good cards against this list. You're going to end up being a lot more reliant in matchups where those cards are on the board on making your reads correctly. You do have your Enchantress in order to shut off Sam Wilson. That can be a Clog on its own a lot of the time. That is a really dangerous thing for your opponent to do, like that, risking the Enchantress, especially on like a turn 5 in a world where you're not magicking on turn 5. They're usually moving that thing back into the Sam Wilson lane, and it's very often going to be full because they're like, I'm going to move it out of the Sam Wilson lane. A timely Enchantress can leave them fully locked up a lot of the time. This is a deck that has a lot of obvious utility, and while there are several counters and reasonable counterplay to this deck that are popular in the metagame, it is still a deck to be feared. I still haven't found the secret sauce with Ajax, so we're just going to talk about the baseline good Ajax deck, and that is the explosive one that is using Abomination out of the High Evolutionary package in order to be a deck that simply has more points. I've tried a bunch of stuff. I want to get Luke Cage in here. It's hard to actually do that and make this deck actually still make sense. It's very frustrating because what am I going to cut? Juggernaut? That card is amazing. Am I going to cut Cassandra Nova in a Thanos meta? What are we talking about? I'm cutting Red Guardian in a Captain Carter meta? What are we talking about? It's just so hard to fit Luke Cage in here, despite the fact that I desperately want to. Now, luckily, Ajax is a little bit of a pseudo Luke Cage in that it is a card that takes the points that you lost to a hazmat and redistributes them to himself. And in a metagame like this, that actually can be more useful. Downsides, of course, are that Ajax is vulnerable not only to Shang-Chi and Enchantress, but like if you leave him alone in a lane, he can get eaten alive by like a Red Guardian even. There's a lot of stuff that can deal with him right now. What this deck tries to do in Thanos matchups is just outpoint them. Ajax with a hazmat can get bigger than almost the entire deck, barring a really crazy Strange Supreme thing. And that's really what you're trying to do in those matchups. Against other decks, you're trying to distribute your power on turn 6 in a way that is hard for them to predict, understand, or react to. The Captain Carter ongoing list is a popular one, and you should be prepared to deal with it when you see it. Typically, the failing of this list, in as much as it has one, because I do think it's a very solid list, is that it lacks explosiveness and it lacks unpredictability. This is a deck that has a lot of vulnerability to a wide variety of tech cards, and it only has the one Cosmo to deal with it unless you are mistaking that Cosmo. It does have very massive point potential, but it reminds me more of a discard style deck that just has a bunch of counters, except the counters to this are meaningfully better than the counters to discard. And in order to make up for that, we do have access to Cosmo. It's just that those counters are kind of like more applicable. You know how when you're playing discard, there's a bunch of stuff that works against you, but there's not one thing that works on all of the discard cards? Like, yeah, Enchantress works on Morbius, but it's not going to work on Dakin, right? That kind of dynamic is not here, because every source of points in the deck is vulnerable to Enchantress, to Rogue, to Red Guardian, right? Like, it just kind of is like that. Those tech cards are incredibly common right now, and it's a little bit tough to realistically assume that they're not going to be there, or even that one Cosmo is enough for you to win. The point potential, massive. The interaction potential, also massive. This deck is named CC Surfer, CC standing for Captain Carter. It's a bit of a misnomer. This is just Surfer, and it runs Captain Carter. There's really not a lot going on here beyond that. This is the same Surfer deck we've always had. That's pretty much what's going on. Forge is back in the deck because now, instead of just Brood and Sebastian Shaw as his targets, we have Brood and Captain Carter. Woo! We're doing amazing here. Now, I will say that Captain Carter does seem to play like a meaningful upgrade to Sebastian Shaw in a decent amount of cases. She's not a strictly better Sebastian Shaw, but a lot of the time she does end up playing like a better version of him. Of course, she is more vulnerable to extremely common tech cards, as we've already discussed, but there is something to be said about her just being another card that we actually like to get buffs on, and that manages to threaten lanes on her own. And she can absolutely do that. This is a reasonable deck. I think this is sort of the deck that I consider maybe the most fair deck in the game, and that's not to say that it's bad. Typically, when I say a deck is fair, I'm using that to mean that it's pretty weak. This is a fair but strong deck. This is a deck that has a genuinely decent amount of points. It's got some okay interaction. It's got a real surprise factor on the final turn of the game. You have US Agent for big guys. You have Red Guardian. You have whatever you copycat. There's some surprises you can pull off. It's a very solid deck. Sauron might be my number one recommendation for anyone who doesn't really want to think and just wants to go out and collect some free wins. This deck is just solid. It's just really, really good. Like, I genuinely think that this deck is underrated because of how easy it is to play. I think good players look at it and think, oh, that can't actually be that good. It is that good. You have great numbers, you have reasonable interaction, you have discounts that you can apply, your guys are incredibly cheap, the Sauron buff was genuinely impactful, Surtur is still an absolutely messed up card, it's a 3/5 with scaling, what the hell are you even supposed to do with that a lot of the time? The power level here is very high, Sauron on 2 is extremely strong, there is not a lot that you have to worry about when you play against this deck. It is a very straightforward deck, or when you play with this deck, I should say. It is a very straightforward deck. You should understand what the games are. It makes the game easy to understand. You should be able to play this deck near flawlessly, almost regardless of your skill level. This card is in a weird spot because it's still a good deck, but it gets outnumbered by the ongoing decks pretty heavily, and that makes it a weird choice to make. Discard's sort of premise, its reason for existing, was that it was big enough to beat all of the mid-rangey decks that played interaction and things of that nature. But now that like 10% of the mid-rangey decks in the game are doing this like weird Captain Carter stuff that actually just goes taller than you some of the time, especially with a Moonstone, what is the point of playing a deck like this that has no interaction of its own? It sort of ends up in second place in its own metagame slot to the Captain Carter ongoing deck, which is being the same kind of, I have a billion points, what are you gonna do about it, bully to the mid-range decks in the game. This means that discard is fine, but not particularly exciting. There are certainly reasons to take the second or third best deck in a general metagame slot, but I typically try to avoid them unless there's a really compelling one. This is a deck that is fine. You will not be upset playing it, but it doesn't have the power it had only a few weeks ago. Move Bounce occupies a fairly similar space. This is a very strong deck, but it is sort of hampered by its own confusion. It's sort of got the inverse difficulty curve of Clog, where this deck gets better the higher up you are, and for most people, I'm not sure it's actually something that I would recommend. What I can say is that the Sage inclusion, I think, is a very clear one for me. Having the ability to just win lanes with Sage and one big threat is just enough a lot of the time. But this is a deck, another deck like Discard, that can very easily get outpointed by just the nut draw from the ongoing decks. It really needs to get something explicitly very strong going in order to compete with some of the other point package decks. What it has going for it is a vast amount of point potential and a very confusing group of final turn cards that can make every turn 6 feel like a 50-50. Khonshu discard has many of the same problems as Bullseye discard, but its upside is, it's like cooler some of the time. I find it hard to believe that I would want to choose either of them, but I find it harder to believe that I would want to be a Khonshu gamer right about now. This is just not a card that is proving to me that it is better than the other version of this deck. I have long been pretty, like let's call it 60-40 Bullseye Khonshu, and I'm still pretty much there. And now that Bullseye is notably worse, I can't think of a reason why Khonshu would be better in that context. What I can say is that I do feel like this deck is more consistent, but it will more consistently produce mid, is sort of where I'm at. The Bullseye deck can sometimes spike to very high levels. This deck is almost always just putting out a medium amount of points. If that's what you want to be doing, I think there are probably better options. The Infinity Ultron Hela list is in a bit of an awkward spot, in large part because of the sort of ongoing stuff. The same thing that's pushing against the discard list, the same thing that's pushing against a lot of the metagame is that the point potential is very high. But Hela has this unique thing where it can make you feel like an absolute idiot for running anti-ongoing tech, because then you queue into Hela and you're just looking at your hand and it's Enchantress and Red Guardian and you're like, wow, I lose. This is the other thing that this deck does that is unique and interesting, and it's use Infinity Ultron along with Grandmaster to set up situations where your Hela goes off maybe multiple times, or maybe your Infinity Ultron stuff goes off multiple times. There's some really powerful things that you can do in a deck like this. It's very difficult to play, but I do think that there is definitely something in this shell. I find the Thena deck to be in a bit of an awkward situation every time I think about what I'm supposed to do at the top end of the curve, because Juggernaut is so good against everything but Thanos, and then you have Red Guardian, which really is solid in this metagame, one of the best tech cards, and I really like it, and maybe it should be in here, but I don't want to cut Juggernaut, and I don't want to cut Cosmo, because Cosmo is excellent at stopping the increase in Shadow Kings and Shang-Chi's that has shown up recently thanks to Strange Supreme. Figuring out what the hell to do with your threes, because I'm not cutting Sage, and if I cut my Cassandra Nova, I end up worse into Thanos, and Thanos is everywhere. It's very hard for me to figure out which of the 5 threes I should be playing. I'm allowed to pick 4. These are the 4 that I'm on. I don't know if I'm right. Also, Sam is gone here. US Agent is back in. For everyone that said Sam will get cut from 0 decks, well, there we go. He's no longer being played in this deck he has absolutely no synergy with. We have gone back to US Agent. I think Mr. Negative is mildly underrated right now. Like, yes, it does run into the same issues with the ongoing deck in that, like, it is entirely possible for the ongoing deck to just have more points than you and there to be very little you can actually do about it. That does happen, but it is still a deck that has very dangerous starts and very dangerous, generally speaking, ends. This is a deck that is very scary to snap into, and it tends to get snapped into in some way, because you can have these games where you actually have a nut draw. You have Mr. Negative Jane Foster, and they're like, oh, they're not doing anything, snap. And like that kind of stuff is really good for you. It makes snapping into like boards that look like they suck a lot more difficult. Just the existence of this deck is a scary thing for even me. I sometimes look at someone who's passed 2 turns and think, normally I would snap. What if they're just Mr. Negative, though? It's not the right way to think, but it should demonstrate just how painful it can be to make that incorrect snap call. This is a deck that has a massive ability to bully and punish people thanks to its incredible output of late game power. Before Strange Supreme came out, I thought we were already trending toward an Enchantress and Killmonger kind of meta. Strange Supreme's release delayed this by a little bit, but we are heading back that direction. And when I say a Killmonger kind of meta, I mean a lot of what I want to do is play Killmonger in decks that nobody would reasonably expect a Killmonger from, because that's when he is the strongest. Getting people to snap into you and then knowing that you're going to win, one of the most powerful things you can do in a game like this. Killmonger is notably a little bit weaker into Strange Supreme Thanos than he is into other versions of the deck, in large part because if they ration their stones appropriately, there won't ever be too many targets for a Killmonger to hit. Luckily, that does not seem to be a common play pattern. A lot of people are just jamming a bunch of stones and saying, it's gonna be fine, Strange Supreme will eat them, and you can take away all of that food by Killmongering it. Of course, against the ongoing Thanos deck, Killmonger is even better, and against Clog, it can help free up lanes that were otherwise being taken over. The backup plan here, or really I should say the general plan here, is just, you know what it is. It's the cook. This is the cook. I got this list, or at least a similar list, from Cougar, and yeah, this has just like always been a pretty fruitful thing to explore, is just this general shell of like Gwenpool, Mysterio, Hope Summers, Mockingbird, Sasquatch. It's just kind of been a thing for a while, like most of these cards have been in the list. And so it's a pretty straightforward deck that I think people probably understand what it is right now. Just a good points package and some metagame relevant tech. I know you know what time it is. It's time to talk about Destroy, which is a little better than it was, in large part because it is a very reasonable Killmonger deck. When this deck is doing its thing, and you get that Killmonger, and you blow up a bunch of Thanos stones, and you get that free death, you get that giant null, you're in a really good spot. This is a deck that for the last few weeks, as we've been in this Thanos and Clog kind of metagame, has been notably better than it was previously. For now, though, I still do think that it's kind of on a relative, well, it's on a relative upswing, but it's a relative upswing from a pretty low place. it might be a deck that is more justifiable than discard right now. I didn't think I'd ever be saying that, but it might be. And I think that is a reasonable place for it to be, although I frankly wish both of them were a little bit higher. This is a very okay deck and a perfect place to end the tier list. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Please remember to like and subscribe. And if you enjoy me yapping, check out the KMBest Podcast on Spotify and YouTube. You can find a link in the description. Make sure you subscribe over there if that's something you'd be interested in. Try to keep all the comments about my chest hair to a minimum, please. I recorded this live and there were some of them in the chat already. So, I'm just kind of bracing myself. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.